In the quiet hours of the night,
Dmitry,
when the
please
world
pick
seemed
up.
to be at rest, Dmitry Volkov sat in his penthouse, overlooking the bustling streets of Manhattan. A life that most could only dream of had been his for years. At 42, he was the architect of an empire worth billions. His biotechnology company revolutionized medical diagnostics, making him not just wealthy but a pioneer in his field. Yet, despite everything money could buy, Dmitry felt a hollow space inside, a distance he couldn't close, private jets, luxury estates across 3 continents, and a staff that catered to every whim. They all seemed to hold little meaning now. Because there was one thing Dmitry never could conquer, no matter how much he poured into his work, the painful rift between him and the family he had lost. He hadn't seen his ex-wife Natasha or their son Adrian in 3 years, not since the divorce had torn them apart. Natasha had moved to Seattle, taking Adrian with her, and Dmitry had let them go. The custody battle had been ugly, but Dmitry told himself that his business was more important. The world saw his success, but only Dmitry knew the cost. His son's face had faded from memory, and he hadn't heard from Natasha in months. But tonight, that all changed. The phone rang, piercing the silence of his opulent office. It was an odd hour, but Dmitry didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a call about a deal, something to add another zero to his fortune. But as he glanced at the screen, his heart sank. The caller ID showed Natasha's name. His pulse quickened as he answered. "Dmitry." Natasha's voice crackled through the line, tense and strained. "It's Adrian. He's sick. Really sick. Dmitry, only your blood can save him. If this story already has you on edge, don't forget to show your support. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love hearing from our family." Dmitry Volkov had everything. He had worked tirelessly to build an empire, and it was one that could withstand anything, it seemed. His biotechnology company had skyrocketed, transforming medical diagnostics worldwide. At 42, he had reached a level of wealth and success most people only dreamed of. His name was synonymous with innovation and cutting-edge research. The world saw him as a genius, a visionary who could turn the impossible into reality. But behind the polished image, something was missing. His penthouse, perched high above the lights of Manhattan, was filled with every luxury imaginable. A grand piano in the corner, sleek modern furniture, art from the most prestigious galleries. The view of Central Park was breathtaking, a reminder of how far he'd come from his humble beginnings in Brooklyn. Yet, as he stood at the edge of the large windows looking out over the city, the enormity of it all felt empty. The view wasn't enough to fill the void inside. Dmitry had come to understand that success came at a price. It wasn't the late nights, the endless meetings, or the travel. It was the personal cost, the people he had left behind. His empire, while formidable, had isolated him from the most important part of his life, his family. When he had married Natasha, it had been a partnership of minds, both driven, both passionate about making a difference in the world. They'd seemed invincible. Their shared ambition had brought them closer, especially after the birth of their son, Adrian. Dmitry had been a proud father, balancing business with family, or so he thought. But as his company grew, so did the demands of his work. Long hours, international deals, and the relentless pursuit of innovation had slowly worn away the bond that had once been so strong. The distance between them had grown, each passing year making it harder to bridge the gap. Natasha had tried, she really had, but Dmitry had chosen his empire over everything else. In the end, it wasn't just the late nights or missed family events, it was the empty promises. The last straw had come when Dmitry had promised to be there for Adrian's 5th birthday, only to skip it for a high-stakes merger in Hong Kong. Adrian had waited at the door, looking up at the clock, expecting his father, but Dmitry hadn't come, and Natasha couldn't hold on to a marriage built on shattered promises. The divorce had been inevitable, but that didn't make it easier. It had been brutal. each side trying to prove their point, their version of the truth. In the end, Natasha had moved to Seattle, taking Adrian with her. The custody battle had been a whirlwind of lawyers, courtrooms, and tabloids. Dmitri had fought, not because he didn't love Adrian, but because he couldn't imagine a life without the empire he had spent years building. Natasha had won full custody, and Dmitri's visits had become sporadic at best. The distance was physical, emotional, and irreparable. Now, standing alone in his penthouse, Dmitri realized that all the success in the world hadn't filled the emptiness. He had everything, yet nothing that truly mattered. The man who had once dreamed of changing the world through science now found himself questioning the choices he'd made. Was it worth it? The work, the wealth, the acclaim, all of it, if it meant losing the one thing that could have made it all worthwhile, his family. Natasha Volkov had spent the last 3 years rebuilding her life from the ground up. After the divorce, she moved to Seattle with Adrian, a city that symbolized a fresh start, away from the pain of the past. At 38, she had returned to her professional roots as a pediatric immunologist at Seattle Children's Hospital, a role that allowed her to dedicate herself to healing children, much like she had once dreamed of doing when she was young. It was a demanding job, but it was one she felt truly passionate about. The work was both challenging and rewarding, giving her purpose each day. She had always been driven, but after the divorce, the focus of her life shifted entirely to Adrian. As a mother, her world revolved around her son's well-being, his future, and his happiness. It wasn't easy, balancing the high demands of her medical career with the delicate needs of a growing child, but Natasha did it with quiet determination. Adrian was everything to her now, her constant source of joy and strength. In their new home in Seattle, Natasha had created a haven for Adrian, a place where he could thrive despite the upheaval in their lives. The apartment was cozy but full of warmth. She'd filled it with books, art, and reminders of their old life in New York, but they'd made sure to carve out new routines and traditions. Sunday mornings were for pancakes, board games, and science experiments that Adrian loved. They spent their weekends hiking the lush trails near Seattle, creating memories that had nothing to do with the past or the fractured family they'd left behind. Despite her busy schedule, Natasha made it a point to be there for every school event, every parent-teacher meeting, and every milestone in Adrian's life. It wasn't easy. She often stayed up late finishing research papers or patient notes, but she never let Adrian see the exhaustion. He had to see her as strong, unwavering, and always there for him. Natasha had become his rock, and she was determined to make sure Adrian never felt the void Dmitri had left. Adrian, for his part, was a bright and inquisitive child, just like both his parents. He had inherited Natasha's keen mind and Dmitri's drive, excelling in school and showing a natural curiosity for the world around him. He had an affinity for science, just like his mother, and spent hours in his room reading about animals, space, and dinosaurs, his current obsession. But there were moments, quiet and fleeting, when Natasha saw the pain in his eyes. He asked about his father sometimes, wondering why Daddy never called or visited. Those moments were harder to navigate than any medical case Natasha had ever encountered. Natasha had learned to handle these conversations carefully. She never spoke ill of Dmitri, no matter how hurt or angry she felt, but she did her best to offer explanations that Adrian could understand. Sometimes grown-ups don't agree, and they have to make hard choices, she would tell him. But that doesn't mean they don't love you. It just means they can't be together anymore. It was a delicate balance, keeping her son's heart intact while also protecting him from the messy emotions that came with their family split. Though Natasha had moved on from Dmitri, the emotional toll of their divorce still lingered. There were days when the weight of everything, the failed marriage, the loneliness, and the absence of the man who had once been her partner, felt unbearable. But she carried on, for Adrian, for their future. There was no room for self-pity. She had learned to put herself aside for the sake of her son's happiness, and in many ways it had become the purpose of her life. It started like any other illness, mild fatigue, a slightly elevated temperature, nothing out of the ordinary for a child his age. Adrian had come into the kitchen that morning, pale and complaining of being tired. Natasha had brushed it off at first. Kids got sick, it was part of life. She felt his forehead, finding it slightly warm, but not enough to warrant concern. "Just take it easy today, sweetheart," she said, making him a piece of toast with honey. "If you're not feeling better tomorrow, we'll keep you home from school." Adrian nodded, his usually bright eyes dimmed with the heaviness of whatever was brewing inside him. He had always been active, full of life, so Natasha thought nothing of it when he went back to his room to rest for the morning. She returned to her work in the living room, the hum of her medical research papers and patient files filling the space around her. But as the hours passed, the sinking feeling in her gut started to grow. Something was wrong, and she couldn't shake the nagging worry that tugged at her chest. By midday, Adrian's condition had worsened. His nose started bleeding, but Natasha dismissed it as nothing more than a common cold symptom. However, the nosebleeds didn't stop. Adrian came into the living room again, a small trickle of blood running down his face. Natasha felt her pulse quicken as she helped him clean up. "All right, let's get you to the doctor," she said, keeping her tone calm for Adrian's sake, but inside her heart raced. Something about this felt different. But it was only when she noticed the tiny red spots on Adrian's arms, petechial rashes, a sign of internal bleeding, that her sense of dread deepened. She felt his body, now cold to the touch, and the realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her mind raced through possibilities. Was it a viral infection? A clotting disorder? But the more she considered, the more the situation didn't add up. This wasn't just a normal illness. The drive to Seattle Children's Hospital was a blur. Adrian, once so lively, now barely kept his eyes open in the back seat, his pale face drawn with exhaustion. Natasha's hands gripped the wheel, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to keep her breathing steady. She spoke to him softly, reassuring him that everything would be okay, even though the truth gnawed at her with every passing minute. Once they arrived, Natasha's worst fears began to take shape. The emergency room, usually a place she was familiar with in her professional capacity, now became a world of terrifying uncertainty. Dr. Rachel Martinez, one of Natasha's colleagues, took charge as soon as they arrived. The two of them had worked together on countless cases, but this one felt different. This was her son. She could feel the weight of her medical training slipping away as the raw emotion of being a mother took over. The tests came fast. Blood work, X-rays, genetic screening, bone marrow biopsies. Natasha's mind swirled as she tried to make sense of the numbers, the results that didn't match the diagnosis she had expected. Adrian's platelet count was dangerously low. His white blood cells were showing abnormal markers. The more they tested, the more the reality of the situation set in. Natasha stood in the hallway, her hands clasped tightly together as she waited for the results. The sterile clinical environment felt worlds apart from the life she had built for Adrian. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not to her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't check it. The uncertainty of the moment drowned everything else out. Dr. Martinez eventually found her, her expression more serious than usual. She led Natasha into a quiet consultation room. Natasha could barely breathe as the words left Dr. Martinez's lips. "Natasha," she began, gently but firmly, "Adrian has a rare form of aplastic anemia. His bone marrow is failing. But there's more. There are markers for a genetic mutation we've only seen in a handful of cases worldwide." The words hit Natasha like a physical blow. Her legs gave out, and she sank into a chair beside Adrian's hospital bed. Aplastic anemia was rare enough on its own, but the added complexity of the genetic mutation made it even more dangerous. The medical team had no easy solutions. This wasn't something they could treat with the typical methods. Natasha's world felt like it was crumbling. She clutched Adrian's hand tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. She had promised him she would always be there for him no matter what, And now, as she watched him fade before her eyes, she couldn't help but feel that she was losing him. The desperation rose inside her as she fought to stay composed. "I'm going to fix this, baby," Natasha whispered, though her voice cracked with fear. She kissed his forehead, trying to offer comfort even as panic swirled inside her chest. "I'm going to make it right." But the truth was, she didn't know how. The doctors weren't sure either. The blood transfusions weren't working and the clock was ticking. The rare genetic markers Adrian had made finding a donor nearly impossible. Natasha contacted every blood bank she could think of, every medical center in the country, but the answers were always the same: no match. The weight of the situation felt unbearable. Adrian's condition continued to deteriorate, his skin taking on a grayish pallor. The bruises from the internal bleeding spread across his arms and legs, and his breathing grew more shallow. The boy she had raised, the boy she had promised to protect, he was slipping away. And in that moment, Natasha knew that only one person could save Adrian. Only one person had the chance of being a match. The one person who had walked away from their family years ago. She didn't want to do it. She didn't want to reach out to him, not after everything that had happened, but there was no other choice. Dimitri had to come. There was no time left. Natasha sat alone in the quiet hospital corridor, her phone pressed to her ear. The sterile white walls around her felt suffocating, and the hum of hospital machinery seemed to fade into the background as she tried to steady her breathing. Adrian's condition was worsening, and every moment spent waiting for a match felt like a lifetime. The medical team had done all they could, but without a compatible blood donor, their options were running out. The decision before her was agonizing, but it was the only one left. Could she really call him? Could she really bring him back into their lives after everything that had happened? Dimitri had been absent for too long. After the divorce, he had made it clear that his empire was his first priority. Their marriage had faltered under the weight of his ambition, and Natasha had learned to live without him. Adrian had learned to live without him. It was easier that way, less painful. She had shielded her son from the truth, told him that his father was just too busy to visit. That business came first for Dimitri. It was a story she had told herself too, but now, with Adrian's life hanging by a thread, Natasha could no longer ignore the painful reality that Dimitri might be the only one who could save him. The phone call felt like a betrayal, an invitation to reopen old wounds. Natasha had vowed never to involve Dimitri again, had promised herself that she would handle everything on her own. But how could she face losing Adrian? How could she make peace with herself if she didn't give him every chance to survive, even if it meant reaching out to the man who had abandoned them both? Her fingers trembled as she dialed his number. Each ring felt like an eternity, and she could almost hear the echo of her heartbeat in the silence. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but now that it was real, the words felt foreign. The phone rang once, twice, and then Dimitri's voice came through the line, groggy but steady, the unmistakable tone of a man who was used to handling business calls at all hours. "Dmitri Volkov," he answered, his voice cold, as though nothing could ever pierce the impenetrable shell he had built around himself. "Dmitri, it's Natasha," she said, her voice barely a whisper, struggling to keep the fear from spilling out. "It's Adrian. He's sick, very sick. Dmitri, I need your help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Natasha could hear the shift in Dimitri's breathing, the sudden tension in his voice as he processed what she had said. She had never imagined that she would have to make this call, never imagined that she would find herself asking him for help after everything that had happened. "What's wrong with him?" Dimitri asked, his voice now sharp with concern, no longer the detached, business-like tone that had defined their conversations for years. "What do you mean he's sick?" "He has aplastic anemia," Natasha said, her throat tightening. "His bone marrow is failing and his blood type, it's extremely rare. He needs a transfusion and the doctors say..." They say only you might be a match." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of silence, of all the unresolved hurt. Natasha could feel the flood of memories crashing over her. Memories of when they were happy, when they were a family, when she had believed that their love could withstand anything. She had never imagined that it would come to this, that she would have to call him like this, with so much at stake. I don't understand," Dmitri stammered. "I've been out of Adrian's life for so long. Natasha, you didn't tell me he was sick. I didn't know. I didn't want to involve you, Dmitri. You made it clear years ago that you couldn't be part of our lives," she replied, her voice raw with emotion. "But he's dying, Dmitri. The doctors have exhausted every option. You're his only hope." Dmitri was silent for a long time, the seconds stretching into what felt like an eternity. Natasha could hear him breathing, his thoughts racing, his mind grappling with the impossible reality she had just dropped on him. The walls of his carefully constructed life were starting to crack, and he could no longer hide behind business, the success, the distractions. "Where are you?" he finally asked, his voice tight, now carrying a weight of urgency she had never heard from him before. "Seattle Children's Hospital," she said, her voice barely audible, too choked with emotion to say anything more. "I don't know how much longer he has, Dmitri. He's my son, and I need you to be there for him, for us. Please." There was another long pause before Dmitri's voice came through, quieter this time, but filled with something more than just business-like detachment. "I'm on my way." The line went dead, and for the first time in years, Natasha allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. The hours on the flight to Seattle felt endless, yet the turbulence inside Dmitri's mind was far worse. As the private jet soared above the clouds, he could barely focus on the documents in front of him. His once crystal-clear thoughts about business deals, mergers, and quarterly reports now felt meaningless. The numbers, the negotiations, the constant race to accumulate wealth, it all seemed irrelevant. Dmitri couldn't stop thinking about Natasha's voice on the phone. The words had shaken him in ways he hadn't expected. "Adrian's sick. Only your blood can save him." For years he had told himself that his absence was justified. The business was his life, and the sacrifices he made, missing birthdays, anniversaries, school plays, were necessary to secure a future for his family. But now, staring out the window at the passing sky, he saw the truth. His success had come at the cost of everything that had truly mattered. Adrian had grown up without him. Dmitri had allowed that to happen, convincing himself that it was for the greater good. But now, with the reality of Adrian's illness setting in, Dmitri felt the crushing weight of his neglect. How many milestones had he missed? How many moments had he failed to witness in his son's life, all because he was too absorbed in his work? The guilt was suffocating. Why didn't I fight harder for him? Why didn't I put down the phone and show up when he needed me the most? The questions hammered at his chest, but there were no answers. Only regret. For years, Dmitri had kept his emotions buried beneath layers of business suits and board meetings. He had built an empire, but in the process, he had built a wall between himself and everything that truly mattered. His mind raced with questions, but one thought pierced through it all. Adrian needed him. He needed to be there now. The realization was a painful one. Despite everything he had built, none of it mattered without his family. The cold truth hit him like a punch. The empire he had worked so tirelessly to construct wouldn't survive without the one thing he had neglected: the people he loved. Dmitri had always prided himself on his ability to control everything. He had orchestrated the rise of his company, turned it into a global leader, and had come to view himself as untouchable. But no amount of wealth, no amount of success could fix what was broken between him and Adrian. He couldn't buy back the lost time, the missed moments, the father-son bond that had frayed beyond recognition. As the plane continued its journey, Dmitri's resolve solidified. He wasn't going to wait for another opportunity. He wouldn't stay on the sidelines while Adrian fought for his life. He had no more excuses. His son needed him, and for the first time in years, Dmitri realized that he needed his son just as much. He would leave his empire behind, at least for now. Business would have to wait. In this moment, nothing else mattered. Dmitri wasn't flying to Seattle to make a deal or finalize a merger. He was flying to save his son, to do whatever it took to make things right. The jet's engines hummed steadily beneath him, but Dmitri felt as though he was on the brink of something much more profound than a simple flight across the country. He was stepping into a new chapter of his life, one where he would no longer be defined by the billions he had accumulated, but by the man he was willing to become for his family. Dmitri's private jet touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport with a sudden jolt that sent his pulse racing. As soon as the wheels hit the tarmac, the rush of urgency in his chest mirrored the speed of the plane's descent. There was no time to waste. His thoughts were only on Adrian, on the son he had abandoned, the son whose life was now hanging in the balance. He barely noticed the swarms of people moving around him as he exited the plane and climbed into the waiting black SUV. His mind was fixed on one thing, reaching the hospital as fast as humanly possible. The streets of Seattle blurred past the windows, and for the first time in years, Dmitri felt the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders like an anchor. He had left too much unsaid, too many moments unshared. He didn't know if he could make up for all that time lost, but he would try. He had to. As the hospital came into view, Dmitri felt a knot form in his stomach. He had mentally prepared for this moment, but standing in front of the glass doors of the pediatric wing, he couldn't shake the reality of it all. The man who had spent years building a reputation, a company, an empire, was now just a father, desperate to hold on to what little time he had left with his son. When he stepped into the hospital, the sterile environment felt jarring after the luxury and control of his world in Manhattan. The cool air in the lobby, the hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses, the distant sound of children crying, everything felt surreal. He barely registered the staff directing him to the pediatric oncology unit, his mind laser-focused on one thing, Adrian. The doors to the unit opened, and there, in the hallway, Natasha stood. Dmitri stopped dead in his tracks. The years had passed, but Natasha was still the same woman who had once been the center of his life, strong, resilient, yet worn down by everything life had thrown her way. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, her scrubs and tired eyes telling the story of a mother who had given everything for her son. They stood there for a moment, frozen. There was no rush of words, no immediate embrace. Their relationship, fractured by time and the scars of the past, hung heavily in the air between them. Finally, Natasha spoke, her voice quieter than Dmitri had ever heard it. "You came. I had to," Dmitri replied, his voice thick with emotion. There was no need for more explanation. The weight of his absence, the silence they had shared for so long, was understood between them. Natasha nodded, her face a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "He's in his room." She turned, leading Dmitri down the hall, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he followed her without thinking twice. There was no business to attend to now, no meetings or plans. There was only Adrian. As they reached the room, Dmitri felt his heart race again. This was it. The moment that would define everything from this point on. He stepped inside quietly, and there, in the bed, was Adrian, pale, fragile, and hooked up to an IV. His son, once full of life, now looked small and vulnerable in that hospital bed. The machines beeped softly in the background, and Dmitri's throat tightened at the sight of the boy who had once been so full of energy. Adrian's eyes fluttered open as Dmitri entered the room. His gaze was bleary, as though he wasn't sure if he was dreaming or not. But then, as his eyes cleared, a flicker of recognition passed across his face. "Daddy?" Adrian's voice was weak but filled with a tenderness that broke Dmitri's heart. The boy had grown up without him, but in that moment it was as if no time had passed. Dmitri's chest tightened. He took a step forward, kneeling beside the bed, reaching out to touch his son's hand. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I'm right here." Adrian's small hand grasped his, the touch sending a rush of warmth through Dimitri's chest. It was a moment he had missed out on for so long, the simple connection between father and son, the unspoken bond that had been broken for far too long. "I'm so sorry, Adrian," Dimitri said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Adrian's tired eyes softened, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You came back." Dimitri nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm not leaving you again, I promise." The moment was raw, the air between them thick with unspoken apologies and the weight of what had been lost. But in that fragile, fleeting moment, Dimitri realized how much he had missed, how much he had taken for granted. The world he had spent so many years building, the empire that had once consumed him, now felt insignificant. In the face of his son's illness, nothing mattered more than being here, being present. As Natasha watched from the doorway, she didn't say a word. She knew the path forward wouldn't be easy. The wounds between her and Dimitri were deep, and years of hurt couldn't be undone in a single moment. But watching Dimitri with Adrian, watching him fight to be the father he should have always been, Natasha felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been broken. For now, though, it was enough to watch them both, father and son, holding on to each other in a way that had seemed impossible just hours before. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air as Dimitri sat across from Dr. Martinez, his hands clasped tightly together. The soft beeping of monitors in the background seemed distant, as though it were happening in another world, a world where the outcome of Adrian's condition hadn't yet been determined. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this helpless. Dr. Martinez was a calm presence, her demeanor professional yet sympathetic. She had been a fixture in their lives during the past few days, but now, in this quiet room, her words carried more weight than ever before. She sat across from Dimitri, the results from his blood tests in front of her. "Well," she began slowly, glancing down at the paper in her hands, "the results are in—" Dimitri's heart raced in his chest as he leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Dr. Martinez. He had never been good at waiting. The years of being in control, of making decisions that shaped entire industries, felt meaningless now. There were no spreadsheets, no meetings to organize. There was only this, a father desperate to save his son. "Your blood tests show partial compatibility with Adrian," Dr. Martinez continued, looking at him carefully. "You have the same rare antigen markers, but not a perfect match. It's close, but not ideal." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of uncertainty. Dimitri's breath caught in his throat as his mind raced. Partial compatibility? It wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but it wasn't a death sentence either. Close didn't offer him the certainty he craved. It only left him with more questions, more fear. "How close are we talking about?" Dimitri's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Dr. Martinez exhaled, clearly weighing her words. "The medical team is confident that, with the right treatments and monitoring, your bone marrow could still help Adrian. The chances of success are high, but there are risks. If his body doesn't accept the transplant, or if the antigen differences cause complications, it could lead to rejection or graft versus host disease." The words rejection and complications hit Dimitri harder than any business crisis he had ever faced. Rejection. That was the fear that gnawed at him. Not just of the transplant, but of Adrian rejecting him, rejecting his role as a father who had been absent for so long. But Dimitri wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, not anymore. "So, what does this mean? What are our options?" Dimitri asked, his voice now filled with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Dr. Martinez nodded, her face calm but serious. "We proceed with the transplant. The next step is to prepare Adrian for the procedure, but we'll need to monitor him closely throughout. The immunosuppressive drugs will help, but there are no guarantees. We also have to make sure his body can handle the bone marrow harvest and the chemotherapy that will follow." Dimitri's mind raced with all the medical terms, the processes, and the risks. But one thing was clear, he wasn't backing down. Not when it came to Adrian. "I'll do whatever it takes," Dimitri said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts inside his head. "If this is what Adrian needs to survive, I'll face the risks. I'm not leaving him again." Dr. Martinez gave a small, approving nod. "We'll move quickly, Dimitri. The sooner we start, the better his chances. But I need to stress again, this is a difficult procedure and there are risks involved." Dimitri clenched his fists in his lap, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had lived his life managing risks, financial ones, business ones. But this was different. This wasn't about profits or losses. This was about his son's life, and for the first time in years, Dimitri understood that the stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced. "Do whatever you need to do," Dimitri said, his voice firm. "I'm in this. I'll stay by his side, every step of the way." As Dr. Martinez went over the next steps, Dimitri's mind was already with Adrian. He had to get through this. He would make sure Adrian had every chance to survive, no matter the cost. The risks were real, but so was his commitment to being the father his son needed, the father he should have always been. He wasn't walking away this time. The days leading up to the transplant felt like an endless blur of medical jargon, tests, and preparations. Dimitri was no longer a businessman. He had become a father, focused solely on one goal, saving Adrian. The weight of the decision had settled deep into his bones, but as each day passed, his resolve only grew stronger. His son needed him, and he wasn't going to back down, no matter what. The hospital room was a whirlwind of activity as the medical team prepared Adrian for the transplant. The scent of antiseptic was overpowering, and the soft hum of machines filled the air. Dimitri stood quietly at Adrian's side, watching the nurses hook up the IVs and prepare the medications. Adrian, pale and fragile, lay in the bed, his small body surrounded by wires and tubes. Despite his condition, there was something undeniably brave in Adrian's eyes. He hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of the surgery ahead, but he trusted his father. Dimitri could see it in the way Adrian's hands sought out his fingers curling around Dimitri's with an unspoken understanding. "I'm here, buddy," Dimitri thought, squeezing his son's hand. "I'm not going anywhere." As the doctors moved around them, preparing for the bone marrow harvest, Dimitri's mind briefly returned to the days when he had first learned of Adrian's illness. The thought of the risks, the potential complications, had been overwhelming. But now, standing here beside Adrian, those concerns seemed distant. All that mattered was getting through this. Adrian's condition had deteriorated over the past few days, and the doctors had explained that time was running out. The bone marrow transplant was the only option left. The procedure itself was complex, involving the extraction of healthy bone marrow from Dimitri, which would then be transplanted into Adrian. The goal was to replace Adrian's failing bone marrow with the healthy cells from his father, giving him a chance to recover. For Dimitri, the thought of having his own marrow harvested was a physical reminder of how far he was willing to go for his son. The procedure wasn't without its risks, and it was painful. Yet, in the face of his son's suffering, Dimitri barely hesitated. The pain he would endure was a fraction of what Adrian had already faced. Dimitri was taken to the operating room first. The nurses prepped him, ensuring he was comfortable as the anesthesia began to take effect. The last thing he remembered was the cold, sterile smell of the room as he closed his eyes and let the sedation pull him under. The bone marrow extraction was a painful process. A needle was inserted into his hip bone, where the marrow was extracted through a syringe. Dimitri gritted his teeth as the pain radiated through his body. It was a sharp, intense feeling, but he endured it without a second thought. Every moment of discomfort seemed insignificant compared to the agony Adrian was facing. As the procedure continued, Dimitri's thoughts returned to the many years he had spent focused on his career, the many times he had chosen business over family. He thought of the moments he had missed, Adrian's first steps, his first words. Now, as the bone marrow was harvested, he realized he would never be able to make up for those lost moments. But he could be here now, fully present, doing everything he could to help his son survive. The pain of the procedure was nothing compared to the pain Dmitri had caused in his family. But in that sterile room, with his own blood and marrow being taken for his son, Dmitri felt a sense of redemption. This was his chance to be the father he had failed to be before. The surgery to extract Dmitri's bone marrow was completed. The medical team moved quickly, transferring the marrow into Adrian's bloodstream. Dmitri, though physically exhausted, refused to leave the hospital. He was there for Adrian every step of the way. He stood by his son's bed, holding his hand, offering comfort during the wait for the transplant to take effect. The hours felt like days. Every second that ticked by added to the mounting pressure. Would the transplant succeed? Would Adrian's body accept the new bone marrow, or would his immune system reject it? The uncertainty of it all left Dmitri feeling powerless once again. The doctors did their best to reassure him, but the reality of the situation was clear. There were no guarantees. This was a risky procedure, and the chances of full recovery were uncertain. Still, Dmitri remained steadfast. He refused to leave Adrian's side. He wasn't going anywhere. Not now, not ever again. The family vigil continued as the doctors monitored Adrian's progress. Natasha was there too, her eyes filled with exhaustion but also a flicker of hope. Dmitri and Natasha didn't speak much during those hours. There was no need for words. They were both in the same place, fighting for Adrian's life, focused solely on the boy who had brought them both together in this moment. Days passed, and Adrian's condition slowly began to stabilize. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. The bone marrow transplant appeared to be taking effect, and the initial signs of recovery were evident. Adrian's blood counts began to improve, and his energy, though still low, started to return. But the road ahead was long. The transplant would require careful monitoring, and the risk of complications remained high. Throughout this time, Dmitri refused to leave. His life, his empire, none of it mattered anymore. He had spent too many years focused on what didn't matter. Now he was committed to what truly counted, being there for Adrian, being the father his son needed. As the days turned into weeks, Dmitri's commitment became clear. He was no longer the detached businessman he had been. He was a father, fully present, living for his son's recovery. The sacrifices he had made for his company paled in comparison to the sacrifices he was now willing to make for Adrian. The toll of the bone marrow transplant, the long nights spent at the hospital, the emotional exhaustion, all of it was worth it. He would stay by Adrian's side no matter what it took. This was his chance to be the father he should have always been. And for the first time in years, Dmitri felt at peace with his decision. He was no longer chasing success for the sake of success. Now he was chasing a future for his son, and that was worth everything. The days turned into weeks, and the steady hum of medical machinery that had once been a constant in their lives began to fade into the background. Dmitri stayed close to Adrian, never once leaving his side. Every day he saw small signs of improvement. Adrian's skin began to regain its color, and his eyes, once dull and listless, now sparkled with curiosity once again. The doctor's cautious optimism slowly grew into confidence. There were still hurdles to overcome, but the worst of it was behind them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, the moment arrived. Adrian's blood test results came back. His bone marrow was functioning properly. His blood counts were normal. The rare genetic markers that had once plagued him were now undetectable. He was in full remission. Natasha stood beside Dmitri, her hand resting gently on Adrian's bed, as the doctor confirmed what they had been hoping for: a full recovery. Tears welled up in Dmitri's eyes as the reality of it hit him. Adrian was going to be okay. His son had pulled through stronger than before. "We did it," Natasha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dmitri could barely speak, but he nodded, his chest swelling with pride and relief. "We did it," he repeated, his voice catching in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt like he had done something right, something that truly mattered. Though the battle was over, a new chapter had just begun. As the weeks passed and Adrian's strength returned, Dimitri realized something that had been missing in his life for far too long. His empire, once his driving force, no longer held the same importance. It had been his ambition, his need for success, that had distanced him from his family in the first place. But now, with Adrian's recovery and the time they had spent together in Seattle, Dimitri saw the truth. None of it mattered if he wasn't present. Dimitri made a decision. He would stay in Seattle, not just for Adrian's recovery but for the future. He knew it wasn't enough to be there for his son in the hospital. He needed to be there every day. He needed to be the father Adrian had always deserved. "I'm staying," Dimitri told Natasha one evening as they sat on the couch, watching Adrian as he played with his Legos. The words felt both simple and profound, a commitment to something more important than any business deal he had ever made. Natasha looked at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You're staying?" Dimitri nodded, his resolve firm. "I can't go back to the way it was. I've missed too much. Adrian needs me, and I need him. I'm not leaving again." The decision to stay wasn't easy. Dimitri's company was global, and his responsibilities stretched far beyond the borders of Seattle. But as he looked at Adrian, his eyes filled with hope and energy, Dimitri understood that his role as a father was more important than any business venture. The time he had lost, years spent chasing success, could never be reclaimed. But the future was still in his hands. For the first time, Dimitri's priorities shifted. He made arrangements for his business back in New York to run without him. He appointed trusted executives to take the reins while he took a step back. The work would still be there waiting for him, but it wasn't the most important thing anymore. Being there for Adrian, being part of his life, was his new purpose. And slowly Dimitri began to rebuild what had been broken. The relationship with Natasha, too, began to heal, not in a rush, but through small, deliberate actions. They began co-parenting in a way they never had before. The walls that had been built during their years of separation started to come down, brick by brick. As the months passed, Dimitri settled into a new rhythm. Mornings were spent with Adrian, helping him with his schoolwork and taking him to the park. They played soccer in the yard, went to museums, and spent evenings reading together before bed. There were no more missed moments, no more business trips that kept him away for weeks at a time. The father he had been was no longer the man who had left his family behind in pursuit of money. He was different now, more present, more connected, and fully invested in the future he had almost lost. Adrian's recovery had been a turning point, not just in his health, but in Dimitri's life. It had taught him that success didn't come from the number of zeros in his bank account, or the power he wielded in boardrooms. It came from the people around him, the relationships he nurtured, and the time he spent with those who truly mattered. In the quiet moments, when Dimitri watched Adrian laughing with friends or explaining something new he had learned, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had finally found his place, not at the top of a corporate ladder, but at the heart of his family. And with that realization, Dimitri knew that this was the beginning of something new. Not just for Adrian, but for all of them. A family finally whole, ready to face whatever came next, together. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Life has a way of testing us, but sometimes it's never too late to make things right. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below and let us know what you would have done in Dimitri's shoes. Could you rebuild after all that was lost? Don't forget to hit the like button if this story touched your heart. Subscribe for more inspiring and emotional tales, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment. Your support helps us bring more stories that remind us of the power of love, family, and redemption.